Thank you so much to everyone who is here for welcoming me and for welcoming each other. I am loving the music, the meditation, the greeting, the words of the hymns. And in a way, all I've planned to talk about is already contained in the words of the first song that we sang. But hopefully, after we speak today, next time you hear that song, next time you sing it, you might sing it a little bit differently. When I talked with Randy and Jim about what might interest you this morning, their enthusiasm was so unbounded, and their list was so long that I really did not know where to begin. So I picked a random place to begin and a few random places to go to, not random in their own internal logic, but random relative to all the possibilities, and I hope that it would be helpful. A little bit about my own background. I grew up in New York City, though I lived as many years in North Carolina as I lived in New York City. I grew up with a traditional Jewish upbringing, and if you know the Jewish denominations in the Orthodox and conservative movements, I was kind of a nerdy kid, never without 2 or 3 books in my hand, and I became aware of myself as a spiritual seeker when I was about 14 years old. Not an unusual time to begin to become aware of oneself and who you are. So since I've been 14, I have spent almost all of my discretionary time and money on spiritual seeking. I studied philosophy and became a philosophy professor. I studied Ayurvedic yoga and became a Hatha yoga teacher. I studied rabbinics at a spiritually oriented seminary with a heavy emphasis on the Kabbalistic tradition. I became an ordained rabbi and served a congregation for a decade. I studied spiritual direction at the Vancouver School of Theology, where I'm now working, and I offered spiritual direction at the synagogue. I studied Jungian psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, but I didn't finish my degree. After 9 graduate courses, I got hired by VST, and I actually said, wow, I can't do everything all at once. And now at VST, I'm a professor of interreligious studies, and I am learning so much about multiple denominations of Christianity and all kinds of world religious traditions that meet in our amazing city. And my husband says that if I die before he does, he will make sure it's written on my tombstone, maybe now she'll find the answer. And just so that you don't get a false picture of my life, I don't have the luxury of sitting under the luminous tree every day and learning and meditating. All of this was done while working, running a household, raising 2 children, and caring for a bunch of companion animals. So for me, a spiritual retreat can be 30 minutes long. And it's okay. Obviously, I have spent a lot of time trying to find the spiritual vocabularies, the words, the images, the right practices to really hold and interpret and receive my own experiences of spirit, my own experiences of the divine. And obviously, for me, no system is enough. I'll share an experience of why, for me, no system seems enough. And then I'll teach a little bit about the non-systematic system that is Kabbalah. The story I'll share I've told it twice before in public settings, so if you were present at one of those settings and you've heard it before, don't worry, the second half of the talk is different. I said that I grew up in New York City. I was one of 3 children. Our oldest brother died as a child. My youngest brother is alive and well, living in New York City. He is a retired NYPD police sergeant, and he has a second full-time job. And as often as I can, I visit him in New York. And I look for opportunities, work and study related, to see him. About 3 years ago, I was in New York taking a 4-day depth psychology course on the topic of cultural complexes. This is the week in which we could talk endlessly about cultural complexes in the United States. But 3 years ago, our teacher thought the best place for us to go to study cultural complexes would be the 9/11 Memorial, right, where the World Trade Center's Twin Towers once stood. And if you haven't been to the memorial, I recommend it. It's beautiful. It's moving. There is no federal political agenda. It is completely funded by local money. All of the tour guides are local volunteers. All of the designers are people local to New York City who lived through the events. And our group happened to be matched up with a tour guide named George. George's brother, John, died in the attack. As George told the story, his brother John was a New York City police sergeant and a first responder to the crisis. And George described his really terrible, terrible day of not knowing his brother's fate. And George told it knowing that many people around the world live for months or years in this kind of state of suspended fear and hope. And still, he talked about his own experience from his perspective. His terrible day of anxiety. And at 11 p.m., George's anxiety ended, his grief began. He received a call confirming that his beloved brother had died. Well, George invited us to ask him questions, but of course, I wasn't able to ask any questions. I just stood there kind of dazed because my story was exactly the same as George's, except at about 5 p.m., I received a call confirming that my beloved brother was still alive. My feelings came back, they overwhelmed me. I felt that I was hovering over some kind of abyss once again and reliving that suspended state. If that wasn't hard enough, our teacher had arranged for us to come back to a classroom later in the day and attend a poetry writing workshop. For 2 hours, we read poetry about disaster and grief and responded to it in writing. And all I could write about was our older brother and our grief surrounding his death. In the evening, I returned to my younger brother's home, my living brother's home, and we talked for the first time really openly about what he experienced and saw on that day. And I understood from his descriptions why he had chosen never to talk about it, because things were so chaotic, so many departmental rules, police department, fire department, building department, were broken. People were doing everything they could think of to save lives and escort the injured. Let's just say it was a very, very intense weekend for me, for my brother as well. On the flight home to Vancouver, I had a mystical experience. As I took my seat on the airplane, the man next to me took one look at me and put on giant headphones. He then actively avoided noticing me for 4.5 hours. And when he put on the headphones, it bothered me. I don't know why. He had his reasons for wanting to be alone. They had nothing to do with me. Everyone is welcome to be a little bit introverted and a little bit exhausted on the flight, but still, what he did sparked something for me. Despite the walls that he put up between us, at least the walls over his ears, we were not actually separate. His actions, the thoughts and feelings behind his actions, affected me. And I saw might not even be the right word. I understood, I felt that his psyche is inside him and also outside of him. Consciousness is both inside each of us and also outside of each of us. And to imagine my consciousness centered in my body, as I usually do, is an illusion. The source of experience lies beyond my body, beyond my brain, beyond my mind. What I am, what all of us are, is not bounded by our bodies. And I saw that, of course, there is life after death, because the source of life does not die. I understood that my old view of an I centered within me and generated by my brain is a false product of unclear thinking. Just as gossip makes it hard to see people truly, so the conventions of language, the dogmas of science, make it hard for me to see myself truly. To see clearly, I have to lift veils of opinion over and over again. As ideas, none of this was new to me. But the intensity of the experience, its numinous quality, was overwhelming. It lasted for 4.5 hours. During this time, I was not at all out of it. I sat in my seat. I typed a report on my laptop. I entertained someone's bored baby. True, I did it by allowing them to smash their hands up and down on my computer keyboard over and over again, so maybe I was a little bit out of it. And I even endured the chaotic crush at baggage claim. And outwardly, the only thing that was different was I did it all with a beatific smile on my face. And many people smiled back, delighted to be lifted for just a moment out of their traveler's stress. And when I got home, the intensity of the experience began to fade. It was still present enough with me that when I explained it to my husband and our young adult daughter, they got it. They understood exactly what I meant, and they even paraphrased it back to me in words that worked for them. But by the next day, I had retreated in a sense, or shrunk in a sense, back to normal everyday consciousness. And I was filled with questions. Like, how could I find the language to talk about the limits on language? And how could I function so well in an everyday mode while being mentally and emotionally not in that mode at all? How could the experience be so cosmic and yet so obviously psychological, tied so closely to all the personal and familial stuff that I had touched on over the weekend. And how, if such experiences are simply gifts of grace, as we might say in Christian language, how can I prepare myself to receive it? How can I summon this kind of experience again? These are only some of the seemingly impossible questions that I began to ask myself. And I'll explore answers to some of those questions by introducing, maybe for many of you it's not an introduction at all, but for talking a little bit about the Jewish tradition of Kabbalah. The Hebrew word Kabbalah simply means reception. Reception as in receiving. If you walk 2 blocks down to the Jewish Community Center at Oak and 41st, and you walk into the front desk, you'll see over the front desk the word Kabbalah, because it literally in ordinary Hebrew means reception, as in reception desk. But spiritually, it means receiving teachings, receiving spirit, and passing those on so that others can receive them from you. The tradition of Kabbalah is at least 1,500 years old, maybe even older. And it's a varied tradition, as you would imagine anything that thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have been doing over 1,500 years would be. It is varied. But there are some themes that hold the tradition together. And one of those themes is the theology, the way we understand God. The Kabbalistic tradition expresses a pantheistic or a panentheistic philosophy. We have both those closely related variations. And in the Kabbalistic theology, there is nothing that exists outside of God. In fact, there is nothing but God. Everything that exists is a manifestation of God. Every manifestation reveals God to us, and every manifestation also conceals God's true nature from us a little bit, because it only shows us one facet or one possible form. The Kabbalistic tradition teaches that this is a true way of understanding God, except it's not true in our ordinary, everyday definitions of truth, because you cannot grasp in any clear way this style of speaking about God. Because once you try to imagine it, you end up with something nonsensical that defeats itself. Let's say we try to talk about God as divine energy. What do you picture? What do you conceptualize with the word energy? Do you picture God as a kind of sun? As a cloud buzzing with little molecules? As a space between planets filled with emptiness? And maybe some cosmic debris of old satellites? I was going to say we know, but even knowing isn't the right word. We know that God isn't any of those things. And yet, this does not stop any teacher in the Kabbalistic tradition from trying to find the metaphors and the concepts and the images that work for them and help them communicate their own vision and experience to others. One view, one metaphor, one concept It is not historically clear where this concept was first introduced and elaborated, but it is associated with the Kabbalistic teacher, Rabbi Isaac Luria, and his followers in the 1500s. They taught God is best understood as a kind of cosmic consciousness, something like what I experienced on the airplane. And this cosmic consciousness, they taught, suffuses, illuminates, fills, animates all modes of consciousness, from the most cluttered everyday consciousness to the most subtle and clear spiritual consciousness. And teachers of this perspective usually talk about 4 levels of consciousness in particular, 4 levels of consciousness where we can find divine spirit. Our everyday consciousness of action, acting in the world, getting stuff done. Our consciousness of our emotional life, the level of feeling. Our intellectual consciousness, both the chitter-chatter racing of thoughts and the big liberating concepts. And finally, a mode of consciousness they call being, the kind where we do experience ourselves as purely close to the divine. Luria and his followers taught that all 4 of these levels of consciousness are present to us all the time. They are all 4 accessible to us all the time. It's just a matter of where we choose to turn our attention. And in their view, what happened to me on the airplane was simply a shift of attention. I turned my attention away from the lower 3 worlds of doing, feeling, and thinking, even though I was still functioning on those levels. That's not where my attention lay. My attention was solely focused on what was present at that highest level of spiritual consciousness. And that explains how all of that could be sparked by intense feeling, with the activity of feeling, revisiting childhood, being blown away by that, with all of that going on, but still my attention was turned toward that highest level of being. And Luria and his followers taught that through a kind of mindfulness meditation, we can learn over time to track where we tend to turn our attention. And once we start seeing what causes us to turn our attention to different parts of our psyche, and what happens when we pay attention differently, we can gradually learn how to direct that attention. I won't be teaching those meditations today, but they are available. Another view associated with a school of thought expressed in the big book of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, written by Rabbi Moses Cordovero and his circle of friends. Written by, not Rabbi Moses Cordovero, Rabbi Moses de Leon and his circle of friends in the 1200s. It's very popular in Judaism to name your kids after Moses. So forgive me if I have confused one Moses with another. Moses de Leon in the 1200s. What is God? God is infinity, but God is known to us as a kind of infinite goodness. And we know that goodness through powerful and beautiful spiritual qualities like wisdom, beauty, eternity, gratitude, groundedness, presence. all those spiritual qualities that are still popular in conversation in English today in the 2000s. And De Leon and his friends understood those beautiful spiritual qualities as emanations of God's goodness. And they would say that what happened to me on the airplane was the spiritual quality of eternity revealed itself to me and filled my attention. And it was offered to me as a kind of gift of grace so that I could experience the divine through the spiritual quality of eternity. And they even use the language of divine providence when they speak about our ability to experience these spiritual qualities. Somehow, even though they describe God as not having any kind of a will, like a human will, somehow God places these spiritual interfaces on our path so that we can know and we can grow. And about 500 years after Moses de Leon, the founder of the Kabbalah for the Masses movement, known as the Hasidic movement. The founder of that movement, the Baal Shem Tov, master of the good name, it's his nickname, not his real name. In the 500s, he said, I'm going to turn that understanding of spiritual qualities manifesting to us into a very ordinary and practical meditation that every single person can do every moment of every day. And he said, I'm going to start not with the most cosmic thoughts, but with the most ordinary thoughts. In fact, the most annoying thoughts, the thoughts that get in our way when we're trying to pay attention. Like when somebody is talking to us and all we can think of is our grocery list. Right? Or when somebody is giving us a gift and all we can think about is how angry we are at that person and don't want to accept the gift. Those kinds of overwhelming, intrusive thoughts. He taught, as long as you know the names of some of those divine spiritual qualities, you can do this meditation. If you find yourself angry when you don't want to be, you say to yourself, wait a minute, that's not my personal anger. Why, that's an inner experience of divine judgment, just sent my way so I could understand the depth and power of divinity. Why, that laundry list, that grocery list that I can't get out of my head, oh, that's just an inner experience of cosmic order. God's desire to bring order to the universe lives in me as a desire to bring order to my own life. Even love, when you're at work, in class, with a grandchild, and you can't concentrate because you're thinking of someone else that you miss, why, that's divine love, a personal experience of it growing inside of you. Another way of understanding that everything cosmic also has a very personal dimension. And any personal thing that happens inside our own thoughts and feelings is a gateway into that divine consciousness. And it's at the times when we feel most estranged from the vastness of the divine, the times that we feel most constricted, most cluttered, most turbulent. All of these teachers agree through the centuries. That is the time at which we are closest to one of these explosive experiences of the divine. And the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, Kabbalah, for everyday people in everyday life, he underscored that teaching about where to find divine spirit with a particular parable that he liked to tell. Imagine that you are just an ordinary person. You've got no political connections, you've got no big donations, and you want an audience with the king. And no one seems to be letting you in. So you decide you're going to storm the palace and see the king yourself. But of course, you know nothing about the royal court, and you're not sure where to find the king. What do? You look for the place that is most heavily guarded, with the most security guards, the most courtiers, the most hidden maze of rooms. You go to the place where it seems most difficult to find the king, and that's exactly where you'll find the king. Your own cluttered everyday consciousness is not something to lament. It's the tool that is most present to us all the time, and the biggest, widest gateway that we have. And that's the teaching that I leave you with. Thank you.